The Battle of Dong Ha in April 1972 was one of the most dramatic episodes of the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive, and it unfolded with a scale of violence and destruction that shocked both sides. Dong Ha was not just a small provincial town. It was the key to Quảng Trị Province, controlling Highway 1, the vital north-south artery of South Vietnam, Highway 9 leading west toward Laos, and the Cua Viet River, the supply route that kept South Vietnamese forces in the north supplied. The North Vietnamese knew that seizing it would open the way to Huế and possibly even Da Nang, and so they committed massive resources to its capture. More than 30,000 North Vietnamese soldiers poured across the demilitarized zone, backed by around 200 to 250 Soviet-supplied tanks, including T-54s, T-55s, and amphibious PT-76s, supported by hundreds of artillery pieces that rained thousands of shells daily on defensive positions. Against this overwhelming force, only a few thousand South Vietnamese Marines, supported by American advisors, and a handful of M48 Patton tanks stood in the way, armed with courage and weapons like the M72 Law rocket launcher that would prove critical against the enemy armor. The fighting around Dong Ha quickly turned into a desperate struggle of endurance. North Vietnamese infantry regiments, each numbering about 2,000 men, launched repeated assaults against Marine positions, while tank columns pressed relentlessly toward the bridges over the Cua Viet River. It was here that one of the most famous acts of the war took place. Captain John Ripley, a U.S. Marine advisor, crawled for hours under the Dong Ha Bridge, hand over hand with heavy explosives slung across his body, all while under enemy fire and close to exhaustion. He eventually placed 500 pounds of charges under the structure and blew the bridge apart just as an entire North Vietnamese armored regiment, nearly 30 tanks strong, was preparing to cross. His action, carried out at the cost of almost superhuman effort, stopped the spearhead of the offensive cold and bought precious time for the defenders. Elsewhere around Dong Ha, South Vietnamese Marines fought tenaciously, knocking out tanks with handheld rockets and in close combat, while U.S. tactical aircraft such as F-4 Phantoms and A-4 Skyhawks flew hundreds of sorties each day to blast enemy convoys, and B-52 bombers dropped their devastating payloads on enemy concentrations north of the river. Naval fire from American destroyers and cruisers added thousands of shells to the already deafening battle. In the process, as many as 60 to 70 enemy tanks were destroyed in the fighting near Dong Ha alone, a staggering loss that blunted the armored power of the Easter Offensive. But the defenders paid heavily for their resistance. South Vietnamese Marine battalions, numbering only a few hundred men each, were reduced to half-strength or worse after days of combat, with hundreds of casualties suffered in holding their ground against enemy formations that outnumbered them 3 to 4 times over. Despite the heroism and the tactical ingenuity displayed at Dong Ha, the sheer weight of the North Vietnamese assault eventually forced the South Vietnamese into retreat. By early May, Quảng Trị City fell, marking the first provincial capital lost to the Communists and delivering a major propaganda blow to Saigon. Yet the stubborn stand at Dong Ha was not in vain. By destroying the bridge, inflicting devastating losses on the enemy armor, and forcing the North Vietnamese to fight for every mile, the Marines delayed the offensive long enough for South Vietnam, with U.S. support, to regroup and launch a counteroffensive later that summer, which recaptured much of Quảng Trị. The battle remains remembered as a clash where numbers told one story: tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops, hundreds of tanks, and endless artillery barrages overwhelming a much smaller defending force, yet where individual acts of courage, like Ripley's demolition of the bridge, shaped the course of events.
Dong Ha became both a symbol of South Vietnamese resistance against overwhelming odds and a reminder of how modern, large-scale conventional warfare had transformed the conflict in Vietnam, pitting tanks, artillery, and aircraft in battles more reminiscent of World War II than of guerrilla war.